About a year ago, I was driving late at night, just before midnight, when I picked up a passenger in a somewhat run-down part of town. The man got into the back seat without responding to my greeting. He was wearing a strange black coat that had pink fuzz lining the shoulders and arms. The first thing I noticed was an overwhelming stench that smelled like something foul. The odor was so strong that I started to cough, trying to catch my breath. The man began to quietly chuckle, and I could see a grin forming on his face, illuminated by the dim lights inside the car. He had a large nose and very distinctive, almost exaggerated features. Trying to stay calm, I asked, "Hey, what's that smell? It's really strong." He looked up at the rearview mirror, and I could see his bloodshot eyes staring back at me with a disturbing smile. He softly said, "Just open a window and keep driving." He then started rummaging through his backpack, eventually pulling out a phone and turning on the flashlight. He pointed the light at his chest, opened his coat, and revealed some kind of writing and symbols smeared in mud across his chest. He was holding his phone in one hand while picking at the mud with the other. Then, out of nowhere, he yelled, "You ever been to a wild party? If not, keep quiet." Just as we pulled up to a red light, he burst into a fit of laughter and suddenly bolted out of the car, disappearing into the nearby woods. I was left in utter disbelief, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stepped out of the car and looked into the back seat, where I found his backpack and dried mud that he had picked off his chest. Out of curiosity, I opened the backpack, only to find it full of mud-covered clothes. Shaken by the whole ordeal, I went straight home. A few years back, I had some time off between jobs and thought I'd give driving for a rideshare service a try. My most unforgettable experience happened around 3 a.m. one night. I picked up two couples from the busy bar scene downtown after a big country concert. The guys were really friendly. In fact, the one sitting in the front seat even shared the same first name as me, so we struck up a nice conversation. I learned that the guys had just met the girls at the bar, and they were all heading back to the girls' hotel. About halfway through the ride, one of the girls announced that she wanted to stop at a fast food place. Even though the ride was actually booked by one of the guys, she insisted that I take her to the drive-thru. The other girl wasn't interested in food and made it clear that she just wanted to head back to the hotel. Their disagreement escalated quickly, and I did my best to focus on my conversation with the guy in the front seat. But suddenly, the guy in the back seat told me to pull over. When I glanced back, I saw that the two girls had started fighting in the back seat. I pulled over and we managed to get them out of the car. Unfortunately, they weren't done fighting and ended up brawling in the middle of the street. I called the police, and by the time they arrived, we had finally separated the girls, though not before one tried to slam the other's head against the pavement. When the officer arrived, I explained that the girl who wanted the fast food was the aggressor. As the officer tried to arrest her, she began to resist, so I stepped in to help restrain her. We eventually got her into the back of the police car, but she started kicking at the windows, so the officer had to take her out again and secure her more tightly. Finally, two more officers arrived, and I was relieved from assisting. As they were handling the situation, the girl kept yelling about being a lawyer and complained that she hadn't been read her rights. 2 years ago, when I was in a relationship and didn't yet have a driver's license, I relied on Uber for transportation whenever walking or biking wasn't an option. One evening, after spending some time studying biochemistry at my university's library, I decided to grab some food and coffee. I ordered an Uber to take me to a downtown Starbucks and then back to the library. My first driver was professional and courteous, and I had never encountered any issues with Uber drivers until this particular ride. I had previously ridden with this driver and had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. Upon entering his car, he requested that I sit in the front seat, which was fine with me. As we started our journey back to the library, the conversation began with casual small talk. It took an unexpected turn when he asked if I was married. I replied that I wasn't and mentioned that I had a boyfriend. He then inquired if we were planning to get married, to which I explained that it was too early in our relationship to discuss marriage, as we had only been dating for about 4.5 months. We ended things in late November. The conversation soon shifted to whether I wanted children. At 21 and focused on my academic career in chemistry, I had no plans for children. I informed him of my stance, and he persistently tried to persuade me otherwise. Each of his arguments was met with my firm refusal. As we approached the library, he made an alarming comment. "If I were your boyfriend, I would make you have a baby." This remark immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. I was deeply uncomfortable and wanted to end the ride as soon as possible. Just before turning into the roundabout leading to the library, he asked me about my birth control method. This question only heightened my anxiety. I told him I wasn't willing to discuss that with him and emphasized that only my boyfriend, my best friend, and my doctor were privy to such information. I quickly exited the car and relayed the incident to my then-boyfriend, who advised me to report the driver immediately. He assured me that such behavior was highly unprofessional and that Uber would take appropriate action. After expressing my concerns about the next passenger who might face a similar situation, I submitted the report to Uber. Later that night, or rather early the next morning as I tend to stay up late, I received a notification from Uber confirming that they had addressed the situation. Around the time I first started doing rideshare full-time, I decided to try out the late-night scene in a town known for its bars. Around midnight, I got a ride request that took me 20 minutes away to a sketchy neighborhood. As soon as I pulled up to the apartment complex, I called the passenger to let them know I had arrived, mainly because I had a bad feeling about the area and wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. The passenger answered and assured me they'd be right out, which put me a bit at ease, but I was still on edge sitting there in my car. Rideshare apps have a 5-minute timer you have to wait out before you can mark the passenger as a no-show and leave. The timer eventually ran out, but I usually waited a little longer and gave another call. When I called the second time, someone else answered, saying they hadn't ordered a ride. Just as I hung up, I noticed 2 guys in hoodies approaching my car, and one of them seemed to be reaching into his waistband for something. I immediately marked the ride as a no-show and got out of there as fast as I could. I made $10 off the no-show. This took place in December a few years ago. I had just started a new job at the mall and was scheduled to work through most of Boxing Day. By the time my shift ended at 10 p.m., I discovered that the last transit service had stopped running at 7 p.m. As a student who hadn't gone home for the holidays due to this job, I was unfamiliar with the holiday transit schedule, so I decided to call an Uber. The driver picked me up right outside the mall, and we engaged in a friendly conversation during the drive. He learned about my work and that I was living alone temporarily because my roommates had gone back to their hometowns. The next day, around 6 p.m., I was at work when the same driver walked into the store. He tried to chat with me, but I had to focus on my tasks and politely declined his offer to hang out later. He left shortly after. When my shift ended at 10 p.m., I left the store with plans to take transit home. As soon as I stepped outside, the driver pulled up next to me and offered me a free ride home. Despite my repeated refusals, he insisted it was on the house. I chose to walk away and took a bus home instead. I was quite unsettled by the fact that he had waited 3 hours outside my workplace to offer me a ride. I reported the incident to Uber, who responded by suspending the driver, issuing a full refund, and providing me with a police report link if I chose to file a formal complaint. In hindsight, I regretted sharing personal information with a stranger. During my freshman year of college, in the first semester, I had a chemistry exam approaching. On my way to a study session, I struck up a conversation with a girl walking nearby and discovered she was in the same class. She mentioned that she was heading to study with a particularly bright student and invited me to join. We spent a few hours in the library, and when the student left, she said she was hungry and asked if I wanted to grab a late-night bite. I was thrilled. This charming girl I had just met invited me to study and then to eat. Of course, I agreed. We went to the Cadoba near campus, where we continued studying over our meal. By midnight, we decided it was time to head back. Despite being relatively close to our dorms, she suggested we call an Uber. I ordered one, and while we waited outside, we continued chatting. Soon, a car pulled up, and the driver called out, "Hey, I'm your Uber, get in." As I approached, something felt off. The car was a beat-up white sedan, and the driver's demeanor was unsettling. I didn't want to judge too quickly, but he seemed like the kind of person you'd find hanging around sketchy parts of town. I paused, telling the girl to wait, and checked my Uber app. The car and driver did not match the description provided. I told the driver, "No, you're not my Uber." He grew increasingly insistent, but when he saw another set of headlights approaching, he laughed maniacally and sped off. We were shaken, but the car that had arrived was indeed the correct Uber. The driver's description matched, and we safely made it back to our dorms. I had just finished my shift as a receptionist at a gym. Being the person who opens up, I was there from 4:30 a.m. until about 11 a.m. Since I hadn't managed to get any sleep the night before, I decided to call an Uber to get home quickly. As soon as I got into the car, the driver noticed my uniform and began asking about my job, my boss, my colleagues, and the customers. He seemed particularly interested in whether the men I worked with were attractive. I'm usually okay with small talk during Uber rides, but his persistent questioning was over the top. He then suggested that I should use my appearance to get a promotion by flirting with my boss. He made comments like, "Just promise you'll do whatever it takes if he offers you a raise, and men like that will do anything for a woman who smiles at them." I grimaced and told him I wasn't interested in such an approach, trying to steer the conversation away. He responded, "You don't actually have to go that far. Just get the raise, and if he makes a move, threaten to report him to HR." Despite my repeated refusals and discomfort with the conversation, he continued insisting that it was the only way to get ahead compared to other female colleagues, and that I should leverage societal advantages. At that point, I was thoroughly frustrated but still far from home, so I decided to stop engaging with him. He then said, "Oh, I see you're the good girl type, waiting for Prince Charming to come along and propose." I remained silent. I prefer not to argue with someone I'll never see again. The driver then launched into a rant about how all marriages are a fraud, claiming it's impossible for anyone to be monogamous because it's against human nature. He suggested that I'd be wasting my time being celibate and should instead focus on having as many relationships as possible, as that's what I'm biologically made for. When we finally arrived at my address, he turned around and asked if I had an Instagram and if he could follow me, also requesting that I rate him 5 stars. Please drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more horror stories.